Welcome to Catastrophes. This is a podcast about disasters, why disasters happen, and the factors that make them happen. We discuss a lot about vulnerabilities, which are the factors that drive some of the effects of disasters. Today, we are discussing the Southern California wildfires that are still ongoing. Uh, Today, I hope to provide a little bit of context on why they have occurred for so long, but then also some of the factors within the surrounding parts of Los Angeles and in Los Angeles, why the fires have spread so quickly. We also are joined by Paul Prevost, who is a 37-year veteran of fire. He's a firefighter of 37 years, sorry, and he offers a really interesting and insightful opinion about how these fires have spread so quickly, and then also some of the factors that we're going to touch on. Before we get into the background and then the interview, the intent of exploring the Southern California fires is not to demean or diminish the experiences of people who have faced this traumatic disaster, but rather explore, question, critique, and ask why this event occurred as it did and why it unfolded as the way it did. So, with that, let's begin. Welcome to today. We have a really interesting episode for you. We're going to be discussing two of the factors of why the Southern California fires have spread so quickly. And then we're going to jump into an interview with Paul Prevost, who is a firefighter of 37 years. He has a number of interesting stories, but then he's also held positions of leadership during disaster responses where he's been a decision maker, and he's got a lot of insightful things to say about some of the background factors of why this fire has spread, but then also some insights into the response from a firefighter perspective. So I'm very excited to have him today. We will get to that interview once we go over some of the background context. So for the overall big picture of the Los Angeles fires, I will be providing a greater, deeper background into the actual fires themselves on another episode. There's a lot of unknown factors that I don't have verifiable information about, so I want to wait until there is more information, and then I'll be able to provide people with a more clear picture that is with verified information. What we do know is that the fires, 12 of them in particular, were ignited on January 7th, and Southern California has seen a significant dry patch drought where these fires have really spread. And then there's also pretty significant and high winds that have blown across Southern California at the time of these fires spreading. So as of January 15th, when I'm recording this, the fires are still ongoing and they are still occurring, and there's a number of homes that are damaged and a number of confirmed fatalities that we will discuss further and deeper into when I talk about the Southern California fires at a fuller context. But really, I want to talk about the primer into why this fire has spread so quickly and some of the reasons why it has unfolded the way it has. So really, to get into the first reason why these vulnerabilities are why this fire has spread so rapidly, I think it comes down to, again, vulnerability, which we touch on every episode, but vulnerability from how Los Angeles as a whole has developed over the last 30 years. So if we go back to 1990, probably a good starting point, because this is really where we see the urban sprawl start to reach a tipping point in terms of the susceptibility to a hazard like a flood, fire, anything like that. Los Angeles as a whole, ever since 1990, has really seen a densification where more structures, more buildings, more roadways, more houses are being built in smaller areas. So as of 1990, we note that 3.7 million housing units, apartments, homes, condos, are in wildfire-prone areas, and that's a significant amount. As of 2020, 30 years later, we go from 3.7 million housing units to 5.1 million housing units in wildfire prone areas, 1.4 million more. So really, I think this kind of illustrates the big picture, and the big takeaway of this first point is that we are building more and more in wildfire prone areas. We're also pushing more vulnerable housing and housing that is not fireproof out to these areas. And that's a really big catalyst for why these fires have blown so quickly and rapidly. So, in short, we are building more in areas that are fire prone. When a wildfire enters a urban area, we call that a WUI, or a wildland urban interface fire. There's a number of statistics I'll tell you about. Across Western USA, we actually see more than 16 million homes be built in a wild urban interface area. And this just means that there's a lot of trees, shrubs, and areas that there could be a potential wildland fire, and then they can enter an urban area. So really, there's a lot of homes that are at risk for any sort of fire. And we will talk about insurance in the interview at the very end. But Paul raises an interesting point about, well, California insurers are thinking about the amount of homes that are built in these wild urban interface areas. So one of the first primer reasons that I really want to cover again is this: how are we developing? And in Los Angeles, how has the development increased the risk to fires? We are seeing more homes built. We're also seeing them built closer together and tighter, but we're also seeing low income homes, trailer parks be built closer to areas that are prone to fires. So this is difficult because a lot of these buildings and structures that are deemed low income are not built with resources that are fireproof. So they tend to catch fire quicker, but then they also tend to be in places that will be in fire prone areas. So kind of a difficult point. But then also, not only do we have low income homes and trailer parks and such that are in these areas, we also see older homes that are about 30 to 40 years to 100 years in in fire prone areas. And oftentimes those homes are cheaper to buy. And so there's a great demand to live in the Southern California area. So a lot of people will accept the risk that, they might not even be thinking about any of the risks before they move there. And so this is kind of the difficult nature of the development of Los Angeles. You have this economic growth. You want to have people come to Los Angeles and the surrounding areas because it's a very nice area. There's a lot of business, there's lots of jobs, there's lots of things to do. So people go there, and when you're moving there and you want to buy a house there, the homes are a better price in the areas that are are more prone to fires and more prone to other hazards as well. So that's kind of the difficult part of development, is you have this balance that we've really swung one way. There is a lot of economic growth that has gone on in the last 30 or 40 years in Los Angeles, but then there's also this risk side where we've really seen an increase in risk because a lot of homes are in a fire prone risk area. So the secondary part of the first point I'm bringing up is also the number of homes that are constructed before 2020. A lot of homes now are a little bit older, and they don't hold up as well to the fire conditions. They are also more likely to catch fire. So when we build newer homes, the materials that they use tend to be a bit better when it comes to fireproofing and making sure that there's nothing that'll catch fire that easily. When we look at some of the older homes, the homes that are from the 1900s, mid to late 1900s, we see that they are typically the ones that have been caught in the fire prone areas. So wrapping up the first point, we see a lot of new development in fire prone areas. We see a lot of houses and housing and buildings for that matter, that are low income or more affordable be in areas that are fire prone. But then we'll also see older buildings that might not have experienced damage in previous fires be burned because they are a little bit older and the fires are a little more tense and direct this year. With that directness leads to our second point. And this time of year, we actually see a lot of fuels and a lot of vegetation be the catalyst for why these fires have spread so quickly. There's very dry conditions, and that's a result of two things. Again, there's an ongoing drought, or there's just a lack of water. It is drier this time of year right now in Southern California. Um, and this means that a lot of the vegetation, if it catches fire, it is very flammable. It will continue to burn and it will burn quicker and spread. There's also been a lack of water. And this is, again, the point that I'll finish up with, not to be too redundant, but we see really these conditions, along with this urban spread and this development, be the catalyst for why this fire has spread so quickly and rapidly and burned many homes. And we're now going to get into the interview with Paul Prevost. Hello, Paul. Thank you for coming on to Catastrophe Podcast. We're really excited to have you today. Uh, as mentioned, we've already discussed kind of the primer and the background to the Southern California wildfires, or fires, sorry. And I want to get your take on a few things, but before I do that, I want to introduce you to our audience. So Paul Prevost has 37 years in municipal fire services and 10 as a chief officer. Not only are you a consultant in the fire and emergency management landscape in Alberta, but you're also an instructor at NATE in the Disaster Emergency Management Program. And then you are also teaching at Lakeland College for the Fire and Emergency Training Center. I know you have quite a few stories, but some of your ongoing work includes being the Director of Emergency Management for Pigeon Lake Regional Emergency Management Agency, that's in Central Alberta, and then you're also an active member of the North Central Regional Incident Management Team, which on the command staff. So applaud you for that. I'm sure you got a lot of stories you can tell us, but really I want to take a good look at some of the reasons and the factors for why the fires near Los Angeles and in Los Angeles have spread so quickly. So I want you to tell us in your own words what an urban conflagration fire is, or what do those words mean, because they're constantly coming up in the media.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and for inviting me to your podcast. I'm excited to participate in this. As you know, I've got my own podcast as well on a slightly different subject. But this is great to talk more about this for sure. Conflagrations are actually, I saw a post recently too about it. Is we used to get these once in a while. Of course, the Great Fire of Boston, Chicago, Nelson, BC had a big fire back all in the late 1800s, and that's when they started building buildings out of stone and brick instead of wood, because they found out that these communities would burn up. And even Brandon, Manitoba had one downtown about 5 years ago where they had a big old building catch fire, and then they had another one and another one and another one. And the problem, of course, is when you get this uncontrolled structure to structure ignition, flying brands, other things such as contiguous combustible materials. So the Insurance Bureau of Safety had recently done some testing of wooden fences and poly fences and stuff. And they actually found that just a wooden fence could conduct the fire from one building to another and ignite it.
Wow.
Whereas if you had a metal fence or a non-combustible fence, the fence would not light your home on fire. There's some really cool video on YouTube you could pull up that actually they do the demonstration. So when you have either flying brands, which is like a crazy ember stream, I'm sure we've seen some of the videos from the Southern California fires where the trees are just letting off huge pieces. And we're not talking little embers the size of your finger. We're talking chunks the size of a 2x4 that are flying and landing in your yard, on your deck, on your roof of your home. You get this structure to structure ignition that doesn't want to stop. This is very similar to the Maui Lanahai fires. Very similar to the Paradise, California fires, the Camp Fire, where once it gets going, Slave Lake was the same. Every house lighted another house, or a car, and then a house, or something else. Fort McMurray, same thing. How do you stop these fires? And unless you have a lot of resources, or in Wood Buffalo, Fort McMurray, for example, they actually bulldozed 2 rows of homes. They got ahead of the fire enough that they were able to get crews in there, and they destroyed the structures to stop the fire.
Wow.
In Slave Lake, famously, they ran a excavator through the mall. One end of the mall was burning, so they cut a swath through the middle of the mall to save the other end of the mall. They got sued for it, but in the end, the lawsuit fell through because it was the right thing to do. You have to stop this contiguous fire, combustible materials, if you will. So I think that's really what happened here. On top of that, of course, the wind was a huge factor.
Yep. And still
Other
is.
factors, yeah, and still is today. It's still going on. I started listening. Well, today's Wednesday, and it started a week ago on Tuesday, I think. And I was listening on the scanner, through the computer, to operations, which their incident command stuff on the command channel was amazing. I teach incident command, and I was in awe at what a great job they were doing on the radio, communicating with all their teams and resources. And a friend of mine said, well, of course, they invented incident command system, which they did. In California, it's actually not called incident command. It's called FireScope.
Oh.
But which stands for Firefighting Resources of Southern California Organized for Emergencies. So anyway, but they've done a great job. But we're talking massive, massive resources. Of course, it's a big area. It's very congested. That's actually one of the problems I saw on a post a couple of days ago, or actually today or yesterday, is Palisades in particular is a fairly affluent area east or west of LA. But the lots are small. It was developed years ago, and the lots are small. Since then, most of the housing is all infill or rebuilt housing with really big homes on small parcels. And each of the homes has, of course, as you know, a garage, maybe a garden shed, maybe a pergola over the pool, or a pergola over the back deck. And of course, these are all things that trapped the flying brands and then caused ignition. So it's very congested. Maui, Lanahai was also very congested. The enforcement of building codes in Lanahai, the reports are, the third phase report, as I mentioned, just came out. And in the second phase report that the FSRI did it, which is the Fire Services Research Institute, was contracted by the governor of Hawaii to do a report. In phase 2 report, they found that because building codes were fairly lax, there was a lot of outbuildings and sheds and extra little mother-in-law suites and all that kind of stuff built on the properties. And therefore, the properties were close to each other. And therefore, when one ignited, another one ignited. And, I have a shed beside my house, too, and it's not built to code. I mean, it's OSB.
Me neither.
It would catch fire easily, right?
Yep.
And then catch my house on fire, probably.
Yep.
So that's probably
we don't want to admit that, though. Being practitioners, but yeah,
that's right. Yeah, being a fire inspector. Yeah, but so I think that's really what this conflagration fire is, and it overwhelms the resources, which you have to question: could there be as resources even available on Earth to stop such a fire? Because you can't really get ahead of it unless you've got some time and distance, which is what happened in Fort Mac, for example, when they were able to destroy a row of homes to create a fire break. But in Palisades, I mean, they didn't have the time with that wind and stuff. We're talking massive. I mean, Palisades fire, this was from Monday, 2 days ago. They had 540 fire engines. I bet you there's not 540 fire engines in Alberta. We were debating it the other day, whether there's that many fire engines in Alberta if you took all of them.
That's a good question.
44 helicopters, 115 hand crews. So that's crews of 20 some people, with chainsaws and shovels and axes and stuff.
Wow.
66 bulldozers, 60 water tenders. That was on the Palisades fire. That's only one of the 6 or 7 that were burning. Because the Eaton fire, which is also in the same county, LA
Pretty.
County had 375 fire engines, 16 helicopters, 50 hand crews, 29 bulldozers, and 90 water tenders.
Wow.
Which is a tanker truck, a water
Yeah.
tanker. So, I mean, the scope is amazing. My wife's nephew responded on, I don't know, 4 or 5 days ago from Wyoming with his crew, with his
Wow.
fire engine from Wyoming, and drove for 2 days to get there to help him. So how do you stop that? That's
That's
the big
crazy,
problem.
right? Well, and there's so many resources to be putting it out right now, and like you said before, just quickly recapping, the urban planning and the development of a lot of Los Angeles has really been so quick that they've been building larger and larger homes, lots of structures very close by. So when that fire comes into a specific area, it can jump house to house very quickly, structure to structure very quickly.
Yeah.
Your comment about conflagration is exactly.
Well, I mean, so Washington State
Mhm.
last year or a couple of years ago tried to pass a new law that all new developments that were in wildfire urban interface, which is what this is, a wildfire that catches the urban on fire, where
Yep.
they meet, in wildfire urban interface prone areas, they were going to implement building codes for that were wildfire resistant. So they were
Wow.
quoting an NFPA standard, I think 1140 or 1141,
Mhm.
and they were enforcing that. I noticed about 6 months ago, I read an article saying that the state legislature voted it down. There was too many complaints. The
Mm.
municipalities don't want to build to those codes,
Yeah.
which is on the outside of your home, it has to be either stucco or hardy board, which is like a cement board that's
Mhm.
fire resistant. And you couldn't have any windows on certain sides, or they had to be, triple glaze instead of double glaze or single glaze. The roofing materials, the soffits, the
All
vents.
fire resistant and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have vents that are less than a 1/4 inch mesh or 3/16 mesh, which also have other problems because then they have trouble getting enough moisture out of the attic. So the state had voted this in to prevent a conflagration, but they reversed it because everybody was complaining there's no way we would want to build to that. So then you get this result. If you would have told everybody in Palisades, hey, you have to build this way, it's going to cost you more.
Yeah.
Well, this is the problem. Look
Yeah.
at there was a ad this morning, Tom Hanks' house and some other house that didn't burn. They were right
Yes,
beside other homes that burned,
that's
but they
exactly.
were
One was almost all stucco on the outsides and concrete.
non-combustible. There was one after the fire in Maui, same thing. Or he said the Miracle House. The Miracle House. It's not a
Yeah.
miracle house. First of all, they followed the Fire Smart principles, which, I forgot to have that up here, but I wrote it down. So Fire Smart principles for a home are nothing, zero combustibles from 0 to 1.5 meters from the home. No shrubs, no bushes, no wood chips, no wooden decks, no nothing, none of that. Within 1 to 5 meter, 0 to 1.5 meters from the home, and then minimal combustibles from 1.5 to 10 meters.
Mm.
So 10 meters is 30 feet.
Yeah.
And then from 10 meters to 100 meters, 100 feet, limited vegetation, everything trimmed up high, so there's no undergrowth for the fire to propagate. Those are the principles that they want to do. Hey, I was deputy fire chief in Clearwater County. It's rural. We had Nordegg, which is a beautiful resort community in the mountains. And you tell those people that they can't have any trees touching their house, and they're going, what? The Alberta Firefighting College in Hinton, the Wildfire Firefighting College, isn't fire smart. So
Yeah.
you wonder why people don't do it. We don't even do it with our own organizations.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So,
And
anyway.
many of us at home don't do it, right? Like you and
Right.
I got some shrubs near my house. And so if my house does catch fire, those shrubs are going to light up. And I think just to take your point a step further, the conditions in California were already dry enough. And so when it's that dry already, a simple spark, not really influencing by how it was actually started, it doesn't matter. It's going to spread very quickly just because of all the dryness and all the dry vegetation.
Right. And these are things that came out in that Maui report that I was talking about, is red flag warnings, which they have in the States. They don't do it in Canada, but they have red flags warnings. So the humidity is really low, the wind's going to be high, red flag warnings. So typically emergency resources would staff up. Like a hurricane's coming, same thing we see in the States.
Exactly.
Canada, we don't typically do it. In the States, they're really big about staffing up. They'll bring all the utility trucks in, and they'll bring in extra firefighters, or they'll bring in. But actually, apparently, this didn't happen a lot in LA at this time, partly because there'd been cuts to their budgets, and so they didn't have the resources and the money to staff up. So that might come out. Maui was the same. They didn't staff up for the red flag event that they had, but they didn't even warn people. They didn't pay attention to it. And so, and we're bad. Nova Scotia, we had the hurricane, whatever it was, the last hurricane that came through. There was one in Florida a month before, and Florida brought in, I can't remember how many thousands of power line technicians and stuff, and trucks and utility trucks, and they staged them ahead before the storm. They declared a state of emergency before the storm. Nova Scotia didn't declare a state of emergency till 3 days after the storm, and that's when they went out and started calling in all the power companies to
all
come.
the people.
So BC did the same. They had the atmospheric river. You and I were both teaching for Nate probably at the time. I was out there at the time, and they didn't declare a state of emergency till 3 days after. The storm happened on Monday. On Wednesday, they said, hey, it's a state of emergency. So, sometimes a hesitancy to prepare the public and the resources, emergency
and the
resources, and the responders to fight it, because you need a lot of responders to fight these big emergencies. And sometimes we're a little too late, I guess, is what you might say.
So sticking on this topic of response, let's talk about some of the ongoing response we've seen and what you've heard. So there's varying reports, depending on where you read, where there's a lack of water. There's no water, but then also there's water pressure issues. So can you talk a little bit about how water pressure in North America is influenced when a house melts or burns down?
Right. They had several problems with that. I mean, there was one main reservoir that was offline apparently for almost a year due to repairs or maintenance or something like that. And it doesn't sound like they had a backup plan for that reservoir. They're just going to do without during that time. So that's kind of a questionable decision that somebody made, saying, we'll do without. Typically, I know as a fire chief, when I had a lack of water for a region, I would have a plan or a backup plan. I mean, we used to have a plan to station a fire. If a pump went down, station a fire truck at a pump house and draft out of the tank, the reservoir, to supply the water system if we needed it. But so that was one problem. The other problem is you had lots of firefighters trying to fight fire. So they're all catching hydrants and spraying the fire. And third is every time a house burns down, the water line melts and leaks. So you have 5,000 homes early on in the fire that were destroyed, they said. It's more than that now, but early on in the fire, well, if you imagine 5,000 water lines that are now running all the time. Everybody's got their tap open. Everybody flushes. What is it? The Super Bowl game, and everybody flushes their toilet at the same time. And you got no water pressure. Well, it's the same thing here. Is they're trying to fight a fire, and there's no water pressure because everything's open.
No. So, and it just allows for the fire to spread even quicker, and that
you can't fight it. And so they called tankers. They didn't actually call. I was online listening while I was doing Nate stuff on the computer or something, and I had the scanner going, and I'm checking with my podcast group that I do the podcast on, and I put out there, say, oh, they're calling for water tankers now. Finally, it was late into the evening that they started calling for water tankers, because they realized that, oh, things have changed. So that's a dimensional shift in firefighting. Is, do I have water supply? If I don't have water supply, what are my choices? So in 9/11, when the World Trade Center was attacked and collapsed, tragedy, they actually brought their fireboat or two in on shore, and they pumped water from the Hudson River to the Trade Center site.
Oh, wow.
For water supplies. San Francisco, very earthquake preparedness city, has their own fire emergency hydrant system, but every fire truck in San Francisco carries hard suction hose, which it's like a hard straw that allows the fire truck to draft water in case of emergency. Any fire truck can go down to a pool or the river or the bay and pump water back up to fight a fire. Really odd. Guess what Calgary doesn't have?
All of
Hard
that?
suction hose.
Oh,
Edmonton, every truck carries it.
oh,
Calgary, they don't.
just Calgary.
Hey, I was in Fort Saskatchewan. I walked in as a deputy fire chief. One of the first things I saw, I said, hang on a minute. These fire trucks don't have hard suction hose. We don't draft. We just get a tanker to come give us water. And I
Wow.
go, hang on a minute. And I did a survey. I found there was 60 some kilometers of roadways in the city that didn't have hydrants. And it's a hazardous materials town. There's lots of
Wow.
hazardous materials that go through Fort Saskatchewan.
Right.
Because for the Easterners, Fort Saskatchewan is like Sarnia, but it's near Edmonton. And I said, we need hard suction hoses. So quickly, one of the first things I did was buy a hard suction hose for all the fire trucks so that we could, if we had to, we had a tanker rolled over on its side on the highway, we could draft water, So these are these preparedness things that, I don't know. I mean, LA County is a very prepared fire department. I mean, they have everything. So, obviously this was too much for them. But the embers was a big problem. The combustible exteriors, the roofs, all that kind of stuff. We talked about that. The outbuildings, alternate water supplies. The other alternate water supply would be tanker trucks. So, have a deal with whoever to bring lots of tanker trucks. And so now they have them, but that takes a while to get going.
Yeah.
If you haven't called them right away, because they were probably expecting to depend on the hydrant system to fight the fire. They never even thought, oh my gosh, the hydrant systems are going down. We don't have water. And then they had to pull those resources in, and you have to change, your tactical operations because of that.
Yep.
Yeah. What else?
Anything else to add? Just in general, what's your general thoughts on how this is gonna kind of unfold over the next few days?
They're waiting for the weather, right? I mean, they're trying to control the fires within their perimeters. Unfortunately, other fire, because it's still windy, it's still dry. Until it rains, it's going to be a problem. The whole recovery, now they're worried about flooding, because as soon as it does rain, the terrain has now been eroded. You have all this, and it's all toxic runoff. We're not talking a forest fire here. We're talking an urban fire. So every home is a bath of, contamination, if you will, from the plastic and all the other materials. They're concerned about the electric cars, because you get the electric batteries are now damaged by a fire. And then, what do they do with those? And there's a list as long as your arm of other hazards they're going to worry about. So how do they recover from that? How do they rebuild? I mean, Paradise, California, which was 2018, I think, and they're still, trying to work through the rebuilding process. But some of the other issues that happened, of course, during this fire, of course, were, the evacuations. So if you look at the Phase 3 Hawaii report, the priorities they came out with was one, now Hawaii didn't have a very strong fire marshal office. And so that led to they found some failures, some recommendations in that, where the state didn't take a high profile on code enforcement, training, fire suppression equipment, all that kind of stuff. Actually, very similar to Alberta, by the way. We didn't have a fire commissioner for a while. We have a fire commissioner and a deputy now, but again, that, if something happened, that might be something people might bring up. But the other one, wildfire education programming. So how do we teach people how to deal with wildfire, right? Including best practices, defensible space. That's some space around the homes, vegetation management. And that's a tough one. If it's a ecologically astute environment, they don't want you to cut the trees down.
No.
And so this has been a problem in California. The people in Palisades have been complaining about wildfire for years. They've been worried about it. How do we get out? How do we reduce the chances? You got to go cut all the trees down. Well, hang on. I don't want to cut the trees down. Water supplies is a problem as well. My wife's niece wrote something. Apparently a big several $billion bill was passed like 5 years ago to improve water supplies, but nothing's been done because it's been arguing about, hey, we can't take up land, environmental concerns, reservoirs, all that kind of stuff. So how do we keep it going? It's okay. Like we have Fire Smart, and you get these communities that do Fire Smart and they do all kinds of stuff, but how do you keep that going long term, that awareness and that dedication to those things. The other priorities, communication system. How do we evacuate people? This is my pet peeve.
Yeah.
So we have in Canada, we have or Alberta, the Alberta Emergency Alert, which is the wireless public alerting system where your cell phones go off when there's an emergency.
Yeah.
And there's been so many problems with that over the years. And people don't get the message, or they get the wrong message. That happened in California, I think, too, is they evacuate all of the city of LA. It was an error. People were going like, and in Hawaii, they had public alerting sirens.
Yeah.
But they didn't sound them.
Yeah.
Partly because people didn't know how to do it. Other was because they thought people might go uphill when they wanted them to go towards the ocean because they thought it was a tsunami, because the people there are conditioned that a siren means tsunami. Whereas that's not what they're for. They're, hey, go check, get some information. There's an emergency. In Fort Saskatchewan, we had the public alerting sirens, but a lot of people don't believe in them. Calgary, actually, about 15 years ago, was going to add public alerting sirens to every fire station in the city. Wow. It was approved. It was done deal. They got quotes and everything. And then the wireless public alerting thing came on, and they said, we're not going to do it. Personally, I think it's a good idea. The recommendations for Maui say exactly that. Public alerting sirens. The Slave Lake, guess what they added after the fire? Outdoor public warning sirens. So, how do we communicate emergencies to the public is a big problem. Utilities, risk planning, of course. We know that the fire in Maui, I believe, started, it was high winds and a power failure, same as Palisades, or the campfire in Paradise was also a utility problem. They don't know yet what happened in California, but how do we address those priorities? Those are the things that are in this report. How do we do evacuations? It was really lucky. I found out when I was teaching the exercise program for Nate, I found out that Paradise, California actually had done an evacuation exercise a couple of years before.
Oh.
And part of their evacuation exercise was to make all lanes going one way kind of thing, get rid of the two-way traffic and all 4 lanes of the road go out. And the staff, it was in a book. I read the book about campfire, and the municipal and police staff said that exercise actually helped them. Wow! Because when they had to do an evacuation, they had muscle memory for where they needed to put barricades, where they needed to put police cars, where the bottlenecks were. They knew it all already, and so when they did have to evacuate, and unfortunately, I think 85 people died in that fire. But they did evacuate everybody in a very quick manner. And they said the exercise actually helped them. And codes and standards is the biggest thing, is fire resistant construction code, which people don't want to do maybe, or it costs more money. Those things. Interesting fact. Now, you remember, you probably saw some media things about this, of course, is that several of the insurers in California and other states, Colorado, etc., have been withdrawing insurance from wildfire-prone areas. State Farm was the first. State Farm is typically a very good barometer of risk. And if they see a risk, they will take action to mitigate it. And you can surmise, and this is just an assumption on my part, is that the insurance companies foresaw the risk was too high, the resources were inadequate, and they withdrew insurance. And they've been doing it quite a bit. And there's 2 or 3 other companies that have done it as well. And so if you're in a wildfire prone area that they are worried about, they say, we're not going to renew your insurance policy. And so they saw this coming. Somebody else didn't, I guess. But I mean, it's such a hard thing to deal with. How do you tell 1 million people that, we're at risk and we have to change our behaviors and all that kind of stuff? You get, it's crazy. Interesting note, speaking of State Farm and insurance, is corporately, they made all their branches take out the electric vehicle chargers that they had been supplying for staff that drive electric vehicles, because they foresee a problem charging electric vehicles on property.
And they're the insurer, so
And they're the insurer, so they're going, hang on a minute, this might be a risk. Right. So I thought that came up on my social feeds about 6 months ago, and I go, well, that's interesting.
yeah,
What are
that
they
is
seeing that
interesting,
we don't see?
right? Well, and just to play off the insurance part, we in previous episodes of catastrophe, we've actually talked about Hurricane Helene, Hurricane Milton. There are specific hazard peril insurances that you need. So if you have general home coverage for your home in Florida, not you might not necessarily get coverage for the storm surge that comes and hits your house.
Right.
Same thing in California, actually. They have good but expensive home coverage, but sometimes there's a rider or there's a secondary add-on for fires that is sometimes just not affordable because it's like, you know, $10,000 a year, which most people probably don't have just to cover the possibility for a fire. Um, and a number of other things like earthquake insurance as well. So, I mean, you're starting to see there's lists upon lists of things you need for insurance just to make sure your home is protected. And there's not just a general all hazards insurance anymore.
Yeah,
And if
like
there is,
Quebec. Well, and we see this all the time in the disaster and emergency management program that we both teach in. Is we keep, and Quebec's taken action in the floodplains
yeah,
where they're saying, okay, we'll rebuild your house once.
yeah,
Now, if you move, great. If you want to rebuild it where it is, we'll pay for it once, but after that, you're on your own.
yeah,
Because, and of course, the federal government, I think, just did like 2 years ago all kinds of new flood maps for all the floodplains and stuff like that. Like, don't
yep,
build here, trying to increase our minimize our risk from floods. Unfortunately, wildfires you can too. If you didn't, I mean, look at the video of the area they built in.
yeah.
I mean,
That's
it's mountainsides, and every little piece of flat land has a house built on it, and the trees are right up against it. And there were actually somebody on LinkedIn, there was a company that had done a whole bunch of mapping, and I saw it, and they showed all the risks. And it's not only California, it's, Idaho, Colorado, everywhere. They're doing all kinds of, like, these places are a high risk, and we need to do something about it. Now, what can you do about it? That's the question.
yeah, that's exactly. So, where can people find your work and or your podcast?
Oh, well, my podcast is called Emergency Traffic. It's a bit of a macabre subject. Is myself and some other very experienced firefighters. We discuss line of duty deaths of firefighters. So when firefighters get killed in a fire, not
Mhm.
got hit by a car on the highway, not had a medical emergency, whatever. It's only when they die fighting a fire.
Mm.
We in the States is very good about investigating these and publishing the reports to learn from them.
Mm.
And therefore, we take those reports and we discuss them just as another way to get the message out to our firefighters today
Mm.
about stuff to watch out for. So it's called Emergency Traffic. It's on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts and all that kind of stuff. We've been going, just started our 4th year.
Excellent.
Some people, non-firefighters, like to listen to it because they had no concept of the detail of the
Mhm.
firefighting operation. So some
Yep.
people like to watch it because of that. As long as you understand that the only reason we're doing that episode is because someone died,
Mm.
but we're really trying to build up that knowledge. The problem is I was just recently at the Fire Department Safety Officers Association webinar,
Mhm.
and the our firefighters, they're all hazards. They go to everything. They go to car accidents, they go to medical calls, they go to alarm calls, and they go to fires. But the chance for the firefighters to build up that data set in their brain of
Mm.
firefighting emergencies and firefighting problems is slim because they're doing so many other jobs.
Yeah.
And so the risk is high for them. So we're trying to build up that knowledge in their heads through the podcast
Oh,
by
good.
talking about these things that have happened so that maybe, it won't happen to them again. So that's kind of why we do that podcast, and that's where you can get a hold of me. And there's an email, emergency traffic.
And you're on social media too, aren't you?
Yep, Facebook, Twitter,
Perfect.
Instagram, Emergency Traffic Podcast. And the email is emergencytrafficpodcast@gmail.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you for coming again, Paul. I really appreciate all your expertise and all your great answers. It was wonderful.